Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A warm welcome to TNI's new monthly webinar series, Ideas into Movement. I'm Lavinia Steinford of the Transnational Institute, where I've been working on public funds and climate finance for the future we want. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time today, TNI is an international activist think tank based in Amsterdam, committed to transformative change and social justice. To that end, we regularly publish new and cross-cutting research and organize events in order to develop collective analysis on key political moments of our time. All these events cost money to organize, so if you have appreciated any of our events, please do consider making a donation. We organized a very popular weekly webinar series from April to July called COVID Capitalism. Our goal this time is to continue the analysis of the impacts of the pandemic, but also to broaden out by looking at other key issues and by putting a focus on the solutions that address today's crisis. As before, our focus will always be on the global dimensions of crisis and the need for an internationalist response. We believe that the left needs to revive and re-articulate its commitment to internationalism. We also want to profile the many critical scholars and activists in the global south who are leading the fight for a more just world, whose struggles and perspectives are far less heard in the global north. I'm very pleased to say that this webinar is also being interpreted into Spanish. So I would like to give a big thanks to Monica and David for making it possible for more people to participate. So this year, we have vividly witnessed how our neoliberal economic order is leading to a series of crises that intersect and exacerbate each other. The environmental crisis led to a health crisis that has led to an economic and social crisis. And amidst this all, we see a climate crisis that is unfolding at a speed many have warned about, but has gone unheeded. Yet blinded by a neoliberal ideology, the political response to the pandemic is already worsening all these crises. We are already seeing economic cutbacks by governments everywhere. So 2 days ago, the UK Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, sounded exactly like his predecessor, George Osborne, saying the country would have to make hard choices, even though we know his policies cost untold poverty, a weak recovery, and a rise in reactionary politics. Our challenge is not only to protect those who have been most hardly hit by the pandemic. In the next decade, we also desperately need to massively increase investments in a just transition, and then of course focus on those who are hit the hardest. There's no escaping it. The left must grapple the question of how we pay for this crisis and finance the change we need. And we must discuss how we can beat back the austerity sirens that are already looking to start another wave of looting from the poor for the benefit of the rich. This is why I'm delighted to present a panel of some of the most leading thinkers and activists who have worked on progressive financing for decades so that they can share their insights. We're joined by Jayati Ghosh, the award-winning economist, former professor at JNU University in India, and Pettifor, director of PRIME, which stands for Policy Research in Macroeconomics, and author of The Case for a Green New Deal. Alvin Mosioma, the founding executive director of Tax Justice Network Africa. And Oscar Reyes, associate fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies and author of the TNI book, Change Finance, Not the Climate. In terms of today's format, you can share your questions throughout the session via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Throughout the session, we will be sharing links to resources and further reading in the chat box. We also know that there's a lot of knowledge among the attendees, so we very much appreciate hearing your perspective on this issue, on these issues. Finally, if you're on Twitter or other social media, we're using the hashtag TNI webinars. So feel free to share your thoughts and reflections with us there as well. To dive straight into the topic, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Jayati Ghosh. Jayati Ghosh is an internationally renowned economist and professor who just recently retired from JNU University. She has won many awards for her work, including the ILO Decent Work Research Prize and the UNDP Award for Excellence in Analysis. She's author of India in the International Economy, published in 2015, and she co-edited the Handbook of Alternative Theories of Economic Development in 2018. Jayati, when you joined us for a webinar back in April, you told us that the economic crisis was far deeper and would have more profound impacts than most people imagined. You also outlined three critical strategies we need to move forward. First, debt cancellation was mentioned. The second you mentioned was pressuring the IMF to issue special drawing rights, SDRs. And third, you mentioned supporting developing countries imposing capital controls. So what's your assessment of the state of crisis now and how countries have responded? In relation, are there any governments who have done better or worse jobs? So over to you, Jayati.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lavinia, for this opportunity to join all of you again, and T and I as well. Yeah, unfortunately, things have actually got worse, much worse than I had even imagined at the time, because the government response has largely been so inadequate. And here I want to point to a very sharp distinction between the developed and the developing countries. In most advanced countries, it's been inadequate, but there has been a significant fiscal response. Whether it is the United States or UK or Japan or Germany, pretty much all the governments have certainly increased their spending. Now we can argue about the nature of that spending, whether it's increased inequality, more to big capital, and so on. All of that is true. But in developing countries, you actually have governments that are spending less in the aggregate, not more. So they have responded to this crisis in the worst possible way by actually cutting back on other spending because they have to increase some health spending and not spending enough even on health. As a result, the pandemic has been continued to spread, has worsened. The economic catastrophe is beyond description across most of the developing world. And we're heading into possibly a very, very deep global depression with all of the attendant social, political, and even military consequences, which are almost unspeakable. So essentially, this has happened partly because of the political economy within countries, but also because none of those things that we had asked for then has happened. The issue of SDRs or the management of global debt and debt of developing countries, sovereign debt in particular, or as allowing countries to impose capital controls. So I think we are now in a deeper hole than we were even a few months back.
Thank you so much, Jayati. Let me go back to what we would like to ask you in addition. Could you provide some more detail on these demands and some of the other financing options you think should be on the table?
Sure. So, first of all, I think it's important to remember that while it's been in general a terrible response, there have been some countries that have done a little better. Vietnam is a very good example of a country that has performed rather well. There are a couple in the Latin American world. Thailand has done relatively better. But overall, the general picture is one where the global architecture has to actually be much more flexible to enable even the countries that want to make positive decisions do so. And so there, I would argue that now, because we've allowed so much time to pass and we've actually made things worse but through the inaction and the wrong policy actions, we have to do another set of very important measures. We have to allow SDRs, and we have to have, it's no longer 500 million will not be, billion will not be enough. We need at least a trillion, 1.5 trillion SDR issue immediately, which will provide developing countries with a lot of basic foreign exchange space. I can explain what that means in more detail if there are questions, but that's one of the first things that we have to do. We have to allow countries not to be at the mercy of mobile capital, because that's what's stopping them. Credit rating agencies hedge funds, private finance that tells them you cannot run deficits even when global demand is collapsing. We have to prevent that from happening. We have to ensure that there is adequate spending on health. At the moment, it is not even 10% of what is required in most developing countries. So we have to massively increase spending on health, including to ensure that when a vaccine is available, it is available for everyone, that you have basic health facilities provided to all, and that the non-COVID-19 diseases, which have been massively neglected over the last 6 months, that they are also dealt with and treated adequately. Now, all this requires money. Where do we get the money? There are a number of, again, largely global, but national also measures that you could take. Taxing multinational corporations. At the moment, they're getting away with murder. And we know that digital companies have actually been great beneficiaries of this pandemic. Some of them have doubled their profits and their asset values. So some of the richest people in the world have become twice as rich over the last few months. Why is that? Because they can get away with not paying almost no taxes by shifting their profits around. We have to stop that by bringing in a system of unitary taxation, whereby every country says we will tax your global profits according to our share of your employment and profit and sales. That will reduce the need or the advantage of shifting profits around. And so we need an international agreement like that. But even if we don't get an agreement, if enough large countries do it, that already reduces the incentive. We need to bring in wealth taxation. The inequalities of wealth were already obscene before the pandemic. Since then, they have doubled actually. It's unbelievable that the top 0.01% has got much, much richer during the pandemic. So we need to bring in wealth taxation. Very small amounts can make a huge difference. A 4% tax on 965 families in India, 965 out of 1.3 billion people, will bring in 1% of GDP that would allow India to double its health spending. So we need to bring in a wealth tax. In order to make sure that people cannot just shift their money out of the country, we should have a global asset register, which will allow countries to know where the wealth is being held. It's also important to remember that in this period, central banks can play a huge role, and they are playing a big role in advanced economies. But in developing countries, the governments are scared, and the central banks are also too scared to actually provide liquidity to governments, to people, to state governments and municipalities. We have to enable much more deficit financing, much more monetized deficits right now, because there is so much excess capacity, so much unemployment, so much lack of demand. Central banks can play this role if we ensure that there isn't a lot of very volatile capital flight. And that means controlling capital flows. And that means the IMF, which has made noises about this, good noises in general, should actually enable countries to actually bring in much more extensive controls that would prevent everybody being kept hostage to these very, very volatile global financial flows. Okay, let me stop here because I'm sure there are many more other interesting things that will be said soon.
Thanks so much. Yeah, you actually still have a few minutes left. So if
okay.
you a little bit more on the SDRs, that would be extremely interesting. So
Sure. So in fact, the special drawing rights is one of those amazing things, which is a real win-win situation. This is global liquidity created by the IMF. So it's kind of a form of money, but it's not money that you and I can use. It's money that governments keep as in their accounts in the IMF. Now, what that means is that the countries across the world get access to a whole lot of foreign exchange, which they would not otherwise have, right? So a big increase means every country will get, in accordance with their quota in the IMF, they will get additional foreign exchange, which they can keep. Now, developing countries, they will get a smaller share, but it's a lot in relation to their own reserves and their own balance of payments deficits. So they would be able immediately to ease some of their problems. They can actually import more, they can reduce some of their external debt, they could pay off a lot of the debt that they're holding through the access to this liquidity. In addition, the countries that won't be using them, the United States obviously is not going to be using it, European countries, a lot of advanced countries won't use them. They could actually donate their reserves They could donate their SDR holdings to the countries that need it. It's a win-win situation. And there's really nothing stopping this except for the global elite and the United States, which has an interest in actually preserving the role of the dollar. So it's if enough people in the world put pressure on their governments to demand it, we could still ensure that what is so obvious, a low-hanging fruit solution to immediate liquidity problems could be made available immediately.
Thank you so much. Maybe another small follow-up. Could you say a little bit more about the global asset register to fight tax evasion?
Sure. So, this is a slightly more medium-term thing, but we have to start the groundwork for this immediately. What happens when you have a wealth tax? The very rich move their money out, and they hire major tax planners and strategists to put their money where people think it's in Panama and the Cayman Islands and so on. But some of the biggest tax havens are also in the developed world. The islands of Jersey and Guernsey in the UK, Delaware in the US, and so on. These are all tax havens. Now, how do you prevent that from happening? Or how do you at least ensure that governments everywhere know which of their citizens and residents are keeping money elsewhere? The only way to do that is to actually have an asset register which records who is holding which asset where. It sounds impossible, but it's not that difficult because most of the assets, when you think about it, are really in the form of financial assets and real estate. That's about 85% of total assets. I mean, sure, there's other stuff. There's gold, there's yachts, there's, paintings and things like that. But the bulk of it is these two. Now, financial assets have to be recorded. Real estate has to be recorded. What we need is for countries to share the information, to maintain proper records, to make this information public, and to share the information with other countries. This is very important for developing countries because a lot of plutocrats in the South keep their money in the North or in tax havens enabled by the North. And the North and the OECD has been very resistant to sharing information. So we need country by country reporting by companies. We need asset registers, national asset registers, which are shared globally. And that would actually, again, be win-win for all the citizens of the world. Yeah.
Wow, wonderful. Thanks so much, Jayati. So now I would like to bring in Anne Pettifor into the conversation. Just to introduce you, Anne Pettifor is a South African-born political economist, author, and public speaker, but also director of Prime. This is a network of Keynesian economists that focus on the role of the financial sector in the economy. Her latest book, The Case for the Green New Deal, was published in hardback by Verso in 2019. She also published The Production of Money in 2017 that explains the nature of money and the monetary system. She was one of the few economists who predicted the global financial crisis and was the co-founder of the International Jubilee 2000 movement. This resulted ultimately in the cancellation of approximately $100 billion US dollars of debt owed by the poorest countries. And you must have felt some déjà vu listening to the UK Chancellor speaking about hard choices. Why is he wrong? What have we learned since the last financial crisis? And what do progressive movements need to put in place, put on the table today in terms of financing? Over to you, Anne. Sorry, I see you're muted.
Oh, am I muted? Sorry. First of all, thank you ever so much for that generous introduction. And can I say I'm humbled to be following Jayati and preceding Alvin and Oscar. And thank you very much. This is a great conversation to be had and such an important one. So I think I want to say that what's different between now and what happened in 2008-9 is that this is truly a global shock, a global crisis. That was largely an Anglo-American crisis. There were countries that were, like Australia and most of China that really were not affected by it in the same way as the Anglo. Now we are all laid low by this pandemic. And that brings me on to what I feel very strongly about is why why, the system of globalization persists even through all these crises. And I want to say that I think it's partly because the left, and I'm going to use that in the broadest sense of the word, progressive forces are ambivalent about globalization. We feel very strongly that there should be free movement of labor. And we feel so strongly about it that we feel that we must support globalization. And I think there's a real problem with all of that. And the problem is this: that globalization, as we know, is not about the free movement of labor. It's primarily about the free movement of capital, about the unfettered movement of capital across the world. And what was so striking about the pandemic was that borders were closed to trade, borders were closed to people. The only borders that were not closed were the borders that capital could cross. And not a word was said about it. It's not an issue. It's not discussed. It's not a matter for debate on the left. The debate on the left is very much domestically oriented. Now, the point is this, that we've learned a great deal from this. We've learned, that this is a global pandemic, that if we insist on abusing nature to make way for farming and mining and housing, that we will strip wildlife of a habitat and ultimately come into conflict with nature, and there will be pandemics. Professor Ian Golden at Oxford University has warned us that there are more pandemics in the pipeline. And we know there are more financial shocks in the pipeline as well, and we're not really prepared for that. And secondly, I think the really important point here is that the reason we're in this position, and I want to stress this, the taproot of all these crises, the taproot of the impetus to mine, to build housing, to cover the land in concrete, to extract from agriculture the maximum output, the taproot of all that is the international financial system, is international capital markets. And while I think Jayati is absolutely right to say we must ask for this and we must demand that and we must have that, we are helpless in the face of these markets that are the effective government of the world. They govern all of our decisions. And for me, it's so important. The reason why Trump vetoed SDRs at the IMF meeting, that crucial IMF meeting in April, was because he was speaking for Wall Street and for the role of the dollar. And that Wall Street wants to keep the dollar powerful, and for very good reasons, right? So we find that, the reason why the Europeans were not able to force Apple to pay 14 billion euros in unpaid taxes was because the European court argued that what Apple was doing by shifting her money to Ireland, and Ireland is a tax haven, and by the way, so is London, so by shifting her profits to Ireland was completely legal and lawful, and they were right. It is the law that capital should be free to move without any hindrance whatsoever across the world. That is the law. And as Jayati says, that is the law that has to be changed. And that is the law that we have to change and we have to campaign for. And we're not campaigning for it because we know it's not a law that is kind of tangible. It's not something that was passed in our parliaments. It's not something that we can, we feel we can hold to account, but it absolutely is the thing that governs us. So I want to argue that we as progressives have to understand that the financial system isn't a national system. It's not managed domestically. It's an international system of governance. And that if we are to challenge that system, we have to act internationally. We have to realize that nowadays, the international system is constructed on the terms set by capital, and we must want to transform that into an international system on terms set by labor. And by labor, I mean by society as a whole. And until we shift that emphasis, and until we understand that we have to change the international system in order to be able to enable governments to raise finance domestically, in order to enable governments to deal with international creditors and sovereign debts. In order for all of this to happen, we need to manage the international system. And currently the international system is managed by Wall Street, the City of London, and Frankfurt. And we are nowhere to be seen. So for me, it's that internationalism of labor that we should be arguing for. And it's that determination of the left to think in those terms, instead of thinking in terms of the local environment, the local health systems, you know, the local trade union organization. You know, these, we have to be internationalist in all of these dimensions.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Maybe since you still have a little bit of time, allow me to ask you a brief question. If you could share what, in order to change the international financial system, what can we learn from the International Jubilee 2000 movement in order to, build up towards that win?
I don't often refer to Jubilee 2000 as it was so long ago, but I think there were some profound lessons from that. For me, the most important lesson was this: these things are not too complicated. You know, macroeconomics, the international financial system, it's not rocket science. And that's what we learned at Jubilee 2000. When we began, people said to us, you can't run a campaign about sovereign debt, multilateral debt, bilateral debt, the net present value of debt. How on earth can you expect the public to understand the net present value of debt? And we said, sorry, it's not rocket science. We'll just explain it to them. And for me, the most inspiring moment of the campaign was when the Treasury complained to me about the kind of lobbying that was going on against the Treasury. And he said, I don't understand what's happening. I'm getting letters on pink piece of paper with a little bunch of roses in the corner, and someone writing to say, I understand that you've set Uganda's cut-off date debt for the calculation of her outstanding sovereign obligations. Who the hell explained to her the cut-off date of Uganda's debt to this woman sitting at her kitchen table? And I said, we did. And it wasn't rocket science. So education and understanding and information and analysis, all of this helps to build capacity. But we've got to do it at an international level, which we did at Jubilee 2000. But, you know, there's the more profound thing, I suppose, which is that, you know, we have to believe in that possibility of transformation. We have to, for example, argue that we know it can be done because it was done before. And I am particularly inspired by the experience of Roosevelt, President Roosevelt in 1933. There's been a book come out about his first administration by Eric Rauchway, which I strongly recommend people read. And what he shows is that on the night of his inauguration, Roosevelt resolved to dismantle the gold standard. And the gold standard in 1933 was financial globalization as we know it today. It was government by Wall Street. And on the night of his inauguration, he said to his advisors, come on, we want the banks to hand over their gold. We want to end the system of the financial system, the exchange rate, and so on, being based on the amount of gold there is in the vaults of the banks. And his advisors said, oh, you can't do that. And he said, why not? And he said, well, they said, tomorrow's Sunday. It's a holy day. You'll have to wait till Monday. And he said, oh, right, okay, well, let's wait till Monday. And on Monday, he demanded the banks hand over their gold. And that began the process, ultimately, of dismantling the international financial architecture that existed at the time, and that ensured that Wall Street was in the driving seat of the economy and not Washington, not the elected government. And as Mariner Eccles, who became the governor of the Federal Reserve under Roosevelt, once said, when we took power, we moved government from Wall Street into my office at the Treasury, right? And we've got to start thinking like that and understanding that's what they did. And they did it with the mandate of a massive popular election, yes, but also with political will and courage. And we must do the same. We have to move the government away from capital markets and back to the people, and in particular back to democratic governments.
Wow, Excellent. Thanks for these lessons. That was very useful.
Can I just add one more point?
Of course, yeah, please.
Sorry, Lavinia, just quickly, because one of the things we think, and I actually think the left doesn't really want to seize political power. Because seizing political power is not a pretty process. It's an ugly process. It's a fight. It's a struggle. You know, it's hand-to-hand fighting, basically. But there's another reason, which is that we must understand what the left and what we don't understand is how much power we have, you know. So we know that the financial system in 2008-9 was on the brink of implosion, complete bankruptcy, insolvency across the board. They were rescued by the central banks. Now we think of central banks as being these big, powerful institutions. Their power derives from the fact that behind them in the United States, there's something like, and correct me if I'm wrong, 130 million taxpayers. And they pay their taxes every year. Tax revenues are coming, and we know that those tax revenues will be coming in for the next 30 years. And similarly here in Britain, since I don't know when, the British people have been paying taxes since 1694, right? And because the bankers understand that that institution, the central bank and the Treasury, has revenue flows coming in on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on an annual basis, and will have such revenues for the next 30 years. That makes the institution powerful. And so what I understand is that we as taxpayers can say, sorry, you can't have access to our central bank except on these terms and conditions. You can't have access to the guarantees and the support the taxpayers offer you. And but because we don't understand that our power, that's our power, we don't make those demands and set that conditionality. And I want us to do that more. Frankly, I would like Taxpayers United International. That's what I'd like to set up. So that we can stand together and say to the private sector, you cannot have access to public sector resources without meeting these terms and conditions. We want mobile capital to be managed. That's the end of my tirade.
Thank you. Taxpayers United International. I think that's a brilliant ending in order to move to our third speaker. I'm sorry, I was just muted. Let me start again. Alvin Mosioma is the founding executive director of Tax Justice Network Africa, a Pan-African advocacy and research network in 16 African countries, working on tax justice and curbing of illicit financial flows from Africa. He has spearheaded numerous civil society campaigns in Africa since 2007 and served as the chair of the Financial Transparency Coalition, FTC. He's author of 2 books on taxation and development in Africa. I try to translate them into English because they're both in German. The first one is called Risk Structure Compensation in the JKV, and the second one is called Money as a Means of Transaction. He holds a master's degree in economics from the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz. So Alvin, I wonder if you could start by sharing what's your assessment of the economic fallout from both the pandemic and also the unfolding climate crisis on the African continent. Why do you think taxation and curbing illicit financial flows is key to that? What does that look like, and what needs to happen? The floor is yours, Alvin.
Thank you very much, Lavinia, for the opportunity, and thanks to TNI for the invite. First, let me start by saying that listening to Jayati and Anne speak, I was just about to propose that we cancel the other 2 speakers and just have the 2 brilliant, gifted speakers continue. I really loved their presentation, really very eye-opening in so many ways, and I hope that I'm going to do justice in trying to at least draw some connection to some of the points that they raised, both Jayati and have raised. If there's one thing I think we have learned from past in terms of crisis is that crisis, in whatever nature, hurts the poor most. You look at the financial crisis, you look at the climate change crisis, the health crisis that we are currently experiencing. The poor, wherever they are, tend to bear the brunt of those crises. And unfortunately, as it were, they are nowhere near where the solutions are being designed in terms of what measures are we taking to address the challenge. And it's out of no surprise that if you look at the solutions that were being offered both in the US and in other countries, in terms of how do we solve the fallout of the financial crisis, is again, the people that were responsible out of the financial crisis that were actually being compensated out of the harm that they'd caused. And in my assessment, the reason for that lies also that we are nowhere as a collective, nowhere near where the decisions are being made. And that's why I really find very brilliant and the solution you're providing over Taxpayers International. When I worked as I was working for taxes in the very beginning, every time I would travel and speak to people and tell them you work on tax issues, the first thing they would say, okay, do you work with the Revenue Authority? Do you work with one of the accounting firms? Or do you work for government? There was the idea of anyone working on engaging on tax is really from those perspectives. The idea of our collective citizens working on issues that has a direct bearing on our day-to-day lives as taxation is really still shrouded in mystery. And I think that's why one of the solutions, and picking up on what you're saying, is that, and one of the gains out of the Jubilee success was really this demystification of issues complex or policy wonky. Debt years back was considered issues that should only be debated within echelons of intellectualism or policy wonks like us. It was not an issue that people will get on the street and start rallying about. And I think that was one of the success of the Jubilee movement, really this demystification and making these issues that affect people on their day-to-day life issues that we can discuss over dinner tables. And I think that's the direction we need to go when it comes to the issues of capital and the capital capture and the state capture. How do we really break down these issues and make them issues that I can have a conversation with? I challenge my friends that one of my biggest challenge I have is every time I travel up country to see my father, see my grandmama, and they tell me, by the way, what do you do? Really being able to explain that in a language, in my own mother tongue, language that they understand is a challenge. And I tell friends, if you not managed that, then you're not doing anything in this world. Your work is really, you're talking to already the converted. And I think that's one of the opening lines. Secondly, to build up on the point you were raising, Lavinia, is that a recent study that came out, I think a week ago, by the UNCTAD, the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development, estimated that the continent loses up to $59 billion annually as a result of illicit financial flows. Basically, as the famous author Ndikumana once put it, that the poor in the South are net creditors to the world. We are the one financing economic development in the North through the phenomenon of illicit financial flows. The money that estimate of about $1 flowing out for every $10 that are being generated in the South, that money is finding itself offshore tax havens spread across the North. So it is really a question of follow the money. Where is the money going? When we are talking about the need for the urgent needs that we have, particularly in this era of COVID, you look at the resource flow. There's more money that is flowing out of poor countries as is flowing back in form of foreign direct investment or any other form of flows. And the foundation of that problem, I think, linked that Jayati was speaking at the beginning, and I think, and build up upon about the infrastructure or the structure of the rulemaking. When it comes to the design of the global tax system, what we see is a conglomeration of rich countries who sit together and decide how, where, and when tax should be paid, particularly when it comes to taxation of multinational companies. In terms of the design of the global tax system, the OECD is on the table in terms of the rulemaking. And one of the calls we have been having over the years is that we need to move that conversation to a more democratic governance system where countries, particularly countries that are bearing the burden of illicit financial flows, also on the table when it comes to the design of we see the different proposals that are coming in, be it the unitary taxation, be it we were still talking of transfer pricing regulations, double tax agreement, all the kind of different ways that determine how multinational companies are paying their taxes. Those are rules that are designed by a collective of rich countries that are really the beneficiaries of this illicit financial flow. So until we are in that situation where we have a global mechanism, we have what a civil society organization have been calling a global tax convention, really under the United Nations, where countries are able to sit together on the table and come up with solutions. What we see happening is that countries are playing catch up. Decisions are being made, and developing countries are being told, now you can come on the table and adopt these solutions. We have come up with this model, we have come up, this is how we think things should happen, and now you can come on the table and we can work together in terms of the implementation of those regulations. So I think on one point, until we change that, one of the clarion calls we were having in Addis in the run-up to the Finance for Development is that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And that applies in so many ways when it comes to policy making. When the voices of the citizens, when the voices of developing countries are not on the table when it comes to the rule making, then they bear the brunt of the decisions that are being made, and therefore they need to shift the conversation of rule making to a more democratic governance system through a UN tax convention. That's the first point I would like to make. I don't know if I'm speaking too fast or I've taken more than time. The second point I think is there has been really, we have relied a lot over the last few years on exposés to be able to understand what is wrong with the financial system. We look at the Paradise Papers, the FinCEN papers that were released recently, the Mauritius papers. Like through those kind of leaks, get an insight on what are the maladies of the current global financial system. And it does not need to be like that. We don't need to we don't need to exist in a world where we have to rely on bold journalists to be able to show that. We elect our leaders to find solutions to those. So I think that going forward, there's been a push for a global transparency mechanism through the so-called ABC of taxation, a mechanism that would ensure that countries are exchanging and sharing tax information on an automatic basis, a mechanism that ensures that countries are, that what we call beneficial ownership of companies, information being who owns and who are the actual beneficiaries of companies, and moving also to country by country reporting in terms of companies being able to report their profits on a country by country basis. This has been calls the civil society organization have been making over the last 15 years. But when we see these solutions being actually discussed in the global arena in the OECD, they many a times fall short of what the demands are. They take the language, they take the shape of the demands, but then they are casted in a way that they don't respond to the problem. If you take the automatic exchange of information, for example, what is happening is that it is the rich countries that are now exchanging information within themselves. The rich country, the poor countries are nowhere near that conversation. So you find that the automatic exchange of information, as much as it has been adopted as a global mechanism through the Global Forum, again, under the auspices of the OECD, it is more the rich countries that are actually benefiting out of that. You look at the issues around the country-by-country reporting, the threshold that is being put that would make it mandatory for companies to report on a country-by-country basis is so high that many of the companies that are operating in poor countries will not need to do that. So you find that the solutions, yes, there are solutions that are being adopted because of the nature of the governance system that I was speaking earlier, the solutions many a times fall short of the interest of what would benefit developing countries. And as a result of this, we see the pace of illicit financial flows going up. When the high-level panel on illicit financial flows that was chaired by Thabo Mbeki came up with their estimate in 2015, they were talking about $50 billion. The most recent studies by UNCTAD, those figures have almost doubled. So we are in a situation, and this is where I fully agree with what Jayati was speaking at the beginning, that the problem seems to be worse and worse, particularly for poor countries, and the solutions are more short-term and they are more adapted to the interest of those that are actually benefiting from the crisis. And that's really the situation we find ourselves, and that's why really I will try to build up on the points that Anne brought about the need of really public mobilization, the need for public education to ensure that the pressure is being built upon those that are making those decisions. Because ultimately, as it were, they say, tax is the price we pay to live in a civilized society. The foundation of the American society was about no taxation without representation. If we are not represented on the table, then we should be resisting paying taxes ultimately, because there's again, if you look at the continent, a huge shift over years. If you look at particularly effective tax in terms of statutory and effective tax, while income taxes that individuals pay has remained around the same, with about 30-35% of effective tax rate, which is the same as statutory tax rate. When it comes to corporate income tax, these numbers have been going lower and lower over time with companies. Now we are not even talking about paying minimal tax. We are talking about paying zero taxes. The Amazons and the Apples, they have not only minimized, they have zeroed their tax, that they don't end up paying any corporate tax because of the kind of global financial system that we have allowed to exist, including the role here that the tax havens play.
Thanks so much, Alvin. That was brilliant. It's really important to hear from you how these proposals so far are really falling short of benefiting countries in the South. So thanks for that. Let me now introduce our final speaker, Oscar Reyes. Oscar is an associate fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies. He's a freelance writer and researcher focusing on climate and energy finance, the Green Climate Fund, carbon markets, and environmental and economic justice. Oscar worked at Carbon Trade Watch, a former project of the Transnational Institute. His publications include Carbon Trading, How It Works and Why It Fails. Oscar is also the author of Change Finance, Not the Climate, a joint book by TNI and the Institute for Policy Studies in the US that was published earlier this year. The book is a guide to different financial tools and policy changes that would be needed to redirect money from fossil fuels towards a Green New Deal. So Oscar, could you walk us through some of the key proposals you make, particularly in the areas that haven't been touched on by Anne, Jayati, and Alvin? Thanks.
I'll try my best. Yeah, the advantages and disadvantages of going last is a lot of the points I'd want to make have been already said far more eloquently than I could ever manage, but I'll try my best. So I think the first thing, so when I started to work on this issue of we were campaigning on climate change and saying we need system change, not climate change. And this was around the time of the 2008 financial crisis. And the refrain back then, of course, was that, well, there's no money for public investment in measures that support some kind of transition away from a reliance on fossil fuels. And then, of course, what happened was the banks crashed the financial system and all this money starts flowing that's made through quantitative easing and trillions added to balance sheets. And then in the aftermath of that, then there's this whole austerity story for 10 years, as we all know. And then now, when this book came out, a similar thing was a similar sort of sensation at some level where, again, we're seeing that, for example, in terms of international climate finance, governments are telling us there's very limited resources available, but suddenly new quantitative easing appears, new money to bail out airlines and fossil fuel companies appears again. So since March, for example, just in the United States, so this time, I mean, there are, of course, many differences. And one of the issues now is that in the United States as well, the Federal Reserve and the government has been buying corporate bonds. And so already we see that since March, just 56 of the major oil and gas companies have received around $100 billion in bailout funding. I mean, this is money that and with no strings, with no conditions. So because remember, like a bailout in that sense, from our perspective, is also an opportunity to actually leverage some kind of political change, and that's, I mean, that's not even a very radical demand. That's just like the basis of doing a deal, that we give you something, we get something in return. And that was even the case when the car industry was bailed out in 2008 in the US. There was actually then, you know, what happened? There was an equity. There was equity that the U.S. government was getting. They sacked the head of General Motors, and the lobbyists for the car lobby were weakened to the point that they were able that the U.S. administration was able to introduce tougher fuel efficiency standards. And I mean, there were many ways in which that fell short, but the basic framework that was used there is the kind of framework that we need to be asking for now, when we're still seeing governments bailing out airlines and fossil fuel companies and are continuing to do so. And actually, in the case of oil and gas companies, I mean, it's really, we saw already in April when the oil prices fell to zero, basically, or negative figures even, that it's really a moment where actually there's that opportunity to reshape some of that sort of some of the financial system and take power away from those types of corporations. And I mean, another point, I mean, again, this is sort of, on the one hand, things that shouldn't happen, but there are certain things that shouldn't happen in order for us to get to where we want to be in the financial future. And one of the very most obvious things that shouldn't happen is the continued subsidization of fossil fuels, both in terms of producer and consumer subsidies, where we still see that there are around 370, 400 billion a year globally going to fossil fuel subsidies, or I mean, or it can run into the trillions depending on how you're counting it. And yet at the same time, we know that if we're to have any chance of keeping climate change within the kind of 1.5 degree sort of global warming that minimizes the disaster that we're already seeing happen today, then actually we need to be keeping fossil fuels in the ground, coal, oil, and gas. And then to do that, it's important to stress the point that actually there shouldn't be fossil fuel subsidies, but also there's a way in which that has to be changed. It is important. It has to be done in the context of climate justice, and climate justice means addressing that with an eye to what kind of inequalities are already generated by climate change and what kind of inequalities could be generated if it's done the wrong way. So what we've seen, for example, is there have been at some level initiatives by the G20 and the IMF, which is saying, okay, we're doing something about fossil fuel subsidies. And they start off at the consumer end, and they start off disadvantaging ordinary people. And then you see the throwback from that in Ecuador and Egypt, as we've seen elsewhere in the past. And because basically, like, actually, it's when you talk about reducing fossil fuel subsidies, that's a subsidy shift that needs to go to helping people who are affected by loss of jobs and livelihoods, to helping consumers in terms of actually making sure that they're not disadvantaged by taking fossil fuels, to giving social safety nets. In fact, there are ways this has been done already. It's not that I mean, a lot of what I've done in the book actually is highlighted a lot of the things that need to happen in the short term. Policies have been adopted by some governments already, and this is the same thing. So it's saying that actually there needs to, like, fossil fuel subsidies need to go, but they need to be shifted in a way that aren't generating further inequality. And that's also, I mean, and the response is riots as well. So it's also counterproductive, because actually you need to have buy-in of ordinary people to tackle climate change. So I mean, those are two very obvious things, like bailouts of fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies that definitely should not be happening. And that we're in a moment where we can open up political space then for change. Then through the book, I look at different parts of the financial system and what can be done with that. And some of these have been covered already, but certainly, I mean, one thing I think that's important to say about central banks is that it's important to repoliticize central banking. I mean, there was a whole period where central banks were seen as a sort of technocracy, which is true, they are, but they have a public, I mean, and to the extent that there has been reclaimed a public interest mandate for central banks, that also needs to be a climate mandate, to say that actually they explicitly have a role in their own terms in tackling green financial risk. I mean, this is how they cast it, and some are sort of tinkering around the edges of that. But I think that it's an area where it's important that we have a public push as well, because actually we're pushing it not exactly an open door, but one that is ajar to a certain extent, because some of the more enlightened people in that space are already aware. I'm being joined, so I'm going to just take off my video, I think. But are aware that there's a need to use central banking and to use central banks as investors, because now with quantitative easing, they're investors of trillions of dollars. And we actually need to say there need to be criteria for that. I think there are big problems with quantitative easing, especially in terms of its role in generating a public debt crisis in the South. But insofar as that system still needs to be unwound, there will be bonds that mature and that will be reinvested by the European Central Bank, for example, and that should be done according to green criteria while that system is winding down. I think then, there are other points that I think that it's important, obviously, then that financial regulators do much more to regulate private banks in terms of putting credit control policies in place and green credit policies. And we see actually in China that there's already been a green credit policy for a number of years that has some impact. It doesn't go far enough, and there are big problems with what happens with China's foreign direct investment outside of its borders. But they have put some controls on what sectors banks invest in, and there needs to be guidance from governments to do that. One of the big myths we always hear is that governments shouldn't pick winners. Well, actually, that's the role of governments, to pick what is socially and environmentally good and what is going to get it out of the climate emergency. And one of the things that needs to be happening there is giving direct guidance to private banks to steer investment in a greener way. And then, I've also talked in the book around the role of. I've also talked about the role of public investment banks, and I think we can see that actually, I think already, like in general, my vision for the financial sector would be one that's smaller, because actually there's a much greater role for public investment there needs to be a much greater role for public investment. And I think the point about recuperating the tax base to avoid corporations or very wealthy individuals from just opting out of that system, the point of that is to regain funds within the public sphere, to be able to then invest that money in a just transition in the energy sector, and in reforestation, in other areas that impact upon climate change. And there are some openings here. One of the notable ones, I think, is that, for a long time, we've had a lot of criticisms of the European Investment Bank, but it has passed, and under a lot of pressure, it has passed an energy policy that now actually does effectively rule out its fossil fuel investments from the European Investment Bank to a large extent from the end of 2021. And I think that opens political space, and that's been as a result of 20 plus years of pressure from non-governmental organizations, from social movements. And I think so there is a role, there's going to be an important role for public investment banks, and also for sort of re-regulating the corporate sector. And I think I'll probably sort of stop around there. But just to sort of back up what's been said, I think there is one of the big problems has been actually that what we've seen over many years is that the public sector has been drained of resources by the way that transnational corporations opt out of paying taxes and shift money across borders, and the same happens with the ultra wealthy. And I think it's important then that we do have a new tax system, that we do have unitary taxation on a global level, and a system to actually kind of recapture some of that wealth, that's our wealth ultimately, within a public space, and be able to use that to direct it towards the kind of changes we need and the kind of investments that need to be made to actually address climate change and to address the climate emergency.
Wonderful, great, Oscar. Thanks for your analysis of climate finance and bringing up the importance of public investment banks, among many other things. At this point, I would like to offer each of our guests a short second round to both respond to the other speakers, which some of you have already done. So you can continue that conversation, but also to bring in key other considerations into the discussion. So please address also how we can advance these proposals. How can we shift the political terrain so that these proposals go beyond being progressive? So how can we shift the political terrain so that these proposals go beyond being progressive wish lists? What can we learn from our failure to do that after the 2008 economic crisis? So how to get in action mode? in addition to these questions, you're a great speaker, so I'm sure I can expand the challenge. I have also some questions from the floor. So let me first ask another question from the floor to Jayati, and then afterwards I'll hand the question for each of you. So Jayati, one question was that SDRs are really important, democracy and taxation, to change the current day capitalist obsession. Therefore, they would like to know what does an ideological shift implies. Wouldn't there need to be an institute to culturally represent that shift? If so, what institute would that be? Would the IMF represent it? Or, yeah, could you share how to go about that? Jayati.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lavinia. And I mean, this is such a great panel. I really enjoyed hearing all of the other presentations. I think everyone has made really important points. But the thing that is staying with me is what Anne said about Jubilee 2000. That it showed that it's not so complicated, that you can do it, and that people will understand if you explain. And I think that, in a sense, this is the key. It's getting people to understand how it's not complicated, getting people to understand how a lot of the economics involved is essentially politics, and making them aware of their power is really absolutely crucial and key. And once you can do that, then governments are forced to respond. I think we have to recognize, I completely agree with Alvin when he says that currently, that the tax management is all in the hands of the OECD, and we need a larger, more participatory body like the UN. Unfortunately, let me be honest here, a lot of the governments who don't really represent their people, even in the UN. And we know that, right? In the developing world, we know that. So it's not good enough. We really need to make it a situation where governments have no choice but to do what is such a large and sweeping public demand. And for that to become evident, we must go out there and explain to people that, look, it's fairly simple. Here is a system which is allowing big multinationals who are raking it in during a global pandemic to get away without paying any taxes. Here is a system that is allowing the richest people on the planet to get even richer and move their money about in ways which means that they don't pay taxes either, and and the plutocracy keeps actually reinforcing itself. And this can change very easily if we bring in the proper rules and we implement those rules. Now, if there's enough of that kind of a groundswell of opinion, then even our most, unfortunately, non-progressive governments would have to listen. I think that's one of the critical things that I want to emphasize. Does this mean we need a global institution to change it? So here's the problem with a global institution. Currently, any international institution will have to represent or reflect national governments. And let's face it, most of our national governments suck. Okay, I mean, we can't pretend that just because they all get together at the same table, suddenly it'll become progressive, because they will not be. So it's not, if you like, it's not the architecture, it's not the stage and so on so much. It is what constitutes that architecture. On paper, the IMF is pretty good. It's in practice that it's been so awful, right? And so that practice reflects global politics, the power imbalances, and the significant lobbying abilities of the global elites, including large corporations. So we have to actually get rid of those. Those are the things that we have to address, rather than the pure structure of it all. I just want to pick up one other question that I thought was addressed perhaps to me and Anne in terms of the MMT, modern monetary theory. Many of you will have come across it. For those who haven't, it's made a lot of waves, especially in the US, in terms of the argument that basically governments can spend using central bank financing indefinitely, and there's no problem. And this is absolutely true for a country like the United States. It is not, unfortunately, the same for developing countries and for many other countries that face either balance of payments constraints or where governments cannot limit their borrowing to their own currencies. And I think this is a basic thing which MMT has also recognized, that there are a lot of conditions under which this operates. So the reason why we have to bring in the financing element for the developing world, certainly, is because many of us face balance of payments constraints. Most governments have got debt that is not in their own currencies. Most governments also face problems of basically addressing access to foreign exchange in general. I mean, basic money is about power. Kindleberger said this a long time ago. International money is about international power. And unfortunately, as long as that is the case, you can't simply say, well, just go out and spend, no problem. However, having said that, straightforward, good old Keynesian Kaleskian economics tells us that when you have massive over excess capacity, when you have unemployment, when you have low effective demand, yes, central banks can just enable governments to spend without it being inflationary, without it necessarily giving you a balance of payments problem. Right. And so that's what we're saying. And that's, I think, was also Oscar pointed to that about the significant role that central banks can play in funding a lot of the necessary expansion and investment. But to do that, we have to make sure that global finance doesn't mess it up for us by shifting capital out, causing big depreciations, causing a financial crisis, and so on. So you need to have the ability to impose capital controls. And it's not just the ability which countries' government have, but that you will not be punished for it in the financial markets. And so I think there the global architecture matters. And the fact that you need the IMF, which has it's in its power to do so, to say that, yes, we encourage countries to put in capital controls, to actually put that kind of a statement. Finally, sorry. Last point, and then I will, just about the finance and the real economy delinking. I just want to come back to Anne's point. Yes, it is delinked. Why is it delinked? Because it's reflecting global power. So it's not completely delinked. It's reflecting the fact that there's been a massive increase in power inequalities. And therefore, to attack that delinking, we have to attack those power imbalances. Sorry, I'll stop here.
No problem. Thanks so much. And yeah, actually, I would like to now move to Anne. So it was great to already hear a bit about MMT, modern money theory. So maybe you could go a bit deeper, especially into the role of private commercial banks and the division between private and public money circuits. And also how to make public monetary institutions more transparent and genuinely democratic, since the central banks we have are definitely not yet with that character. So, Anne, could you share your thoughts on that? I'm sorry. You're again muted. Thank you.
Sorry. So I think MMT get a lot of monetary theory right, but they also get an awful lot wrong. And Jayati's already expressed the view that it's all very well if you live in the United States to talk about printing the dollar, that's fine. But it's not the case. If, like me, you're South African born and you watch the South African currency devalue as capital flight rushes towards the dollar at the height of the pandemic, when South Africa more than anything else needed stability of her currency. So, I think MMT is a very American phenomenon, really. But for me, I think for us to understand this, we really have to go back to what is the nature of money. And money isn't a printed, a piece of paper that's printed. And the central bank is not like a printer, because the assumption is that the printer doesn't have ink, for example, loaded up on the printer, is not driven by electricity, and doesn't have a functioning machine, right? So the point about money is that all money is nothing more, and Joseph Schumpeter explained this, than a promise to pay. That's all it is. And my dear friend David Graeber, who died so suddenly, so recently, and who wrote the wonderful book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, he showed that 5,000 years ago, we had a system of money and credit, right? We also had a system of barter. If we didn't trust the people that we were trading with, we demanded barter. Give us your pelts of skin in exchange for this, but we don't trust you to deal with our credit system, which is that is based on promises. Now, we make promises because we have a chief in the village who upholds our promise. If we say we're going to promise to pay and we don't, the chief punishes us, or there is a way in which, you know, the thing is sorted. So all money is an obligation, ultimately, both public money, both central bank money, as well as commercial bank money. Where the commercial bank enters numbers into a computer and transfers £300,000 or dollars into your account so you can buy a house or you can buy a shed, that's not the end of the process. There is an obligation there. You sign a contract, you promise to pay over a period of time and at a rate of interest, and you very often offer collateral, right? That's what money, if you're just printing pieces of paper, it's not money. So I think that's really important for us to understand. Even the United States cannot go on printing money endlessly and spending. At some point, those obligations have to be met. And at some point, the United States is going to have to find the resources to meet those obligations, and they can't just be pieces of green paper, right? So I just want us to understand that all money is this sort of obligation. So central banks, however, because as I said earlier, they're backed by millions of taxpayers. Unlike me, when I apply for the bank, you know, I haven't got revenue coming in for the next 30 years, absolutely certainly, even if I have a good business, right? So I have to offer collateral. But the central bank has got this revenue coming through every year, every month, every 6 months, and every 10 years and 30 years, which enables it to say, I promise to pay. And I can. Now, the thing that's so awful to watch, and this is what Alvin touched on, was the impotence, if you like, of governments in developing countries. I don't like developing low-income countries, right? And I watched my own country, South Africa. It's got a central bank. It has taxpayers. It has fantastic resources because it's gold, uranium, silver. The amount of minerals and wealth in South Africa is extraordinary, right? And yet it refuses to use that power. It says, no, we'll wait for the market to provide the finance. We'll wait for, you know, Wall Street or the City of London to give us foreign investment so that we can save our people from this awful pandemic. Well, that's not going to happen because as we saw what happened for South Africa, the minute the pandemic hit, capital flew out. It stampeded out, right? That crashed her exchange rate, raised the cost of the dollar. Now, the dollar is absolutely essential for low-income countries because the Americans signed a deal with the Saudis back in 1973. You can't buy oil if you don't have dollars. You can't pay for it if you don't have dollars. Similarly, you can't buy pharmaceuticals if you don't have dollars. And this is where Jayati's point came in, you know, that because South Africa didn't have dollars, she would have really liked the SDRs from the IMF. But Trump vetoed that. And he vetoed it because he didn't want countries like Venezuela and Iran and China to get hold of those dollars. So South Africa was one of the victims of that, right? And even the swap scheme that Jerome Powell instigated, where he offered to swap dollars for local currency with certain central banks, that didn't include South Africa, and it didn't include Venezuela and China and Iran either, right? So, you know, we have this deeply unfair and unstable system, and we have to recognize our power. How we do that, I think Jayati is right. It's about education. It's about the thing, and I have to just finally end on this Jubilee 2000 point. We were amazed, and the IMF was amazed. The World Bank was stunned. They would go to they would end up in Australia, or they'd be in some part of Central America, or suddenly they'd be in Germany, or they'd be in some remote part of the United States, and the word Jubilee 2000 would come up, and they'd say, how the hell are you a global organization? We weren't. We had no money. We had hardly any resources, really. What we had was a message, a campaign, advocacy points which we shared around the world amongst us all, informed by what we were hearing from the countries, the sovereign debtors. You know, we worked all of this together. We worked together, right? We didn't have divides, north-south divides. We worked together. And that alliance was what was so powerful. We need to recreate it.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry to cut you short, but it's very interesting. Maybe just to still have some time for inputs from Alvin and Oscar. Let me put a question to you, Alvin. Besides paying taxes fairly, What should be the most important contribution of the private sector to avoid future economic crisis and stop exploiting the global South countries? Could you respond to that, as well as to the previous some of the previous questions I shared with you all as speakers? Alvin, please.
Sort of unmute my mic. Okay, thank you. So let me just building up on the points that Anne and Jayati were making. I fully agree with you, Jayati, that governments suck in many ways and in so many places, but states don't, and states can't. So I think that when you're pushing for a system that that is more representative, that is more democratic, is under the assumption that we are not having governments on those tables, we're having states on that table. So the assumptions we make that states in the long term will be able to represent the interests of people. And therefore, I think the question there for me is really asking ourselves, how do we, like both at the national and at the global level, how do we make governments represent the interests of the people? Because even at the very domestic level, you find, we just give an example, we recently filed a case in the Kenyan court against a double tax treaty between Mauritius and Kenya, and which we feel that would significantly hinder the ability of the Kenyan state to collect revenues. And the biggest opposition we are getting is from those that are actually supposed to be collecting that money. So there's a dichotomy there in terms of where the state interests are and what government interests are, particularly in an environment where both globally and nationally, many of our states are captured. So, but I do believe that it's very possible to manufacture political will. It has happened before, and it's possible through public mobilization, through public pressure, to be able to steer governments and state into the direction where they are serving the interests of the majority in terms of when it comes to fulfilling their state obligations. I think that the challenge we face is systemic. The challenge we face, both from the financial perspective, from an economic perspective generally, is a systemic problem. And this requires a structural problem. So structures in that sense do matter. They are responsible when we look at, for example, in the continent, the history led by the World Bank, not just in Africa, but in other developing countries of structural adjustment and the implications they have even today when you look at the health system and the incapacity of health system to be able to respond to COVID goes back to the history of the structural adjustment, and which came in from the system that was kind of pushing these kind of neoliberal philosophies. So I think that we need to have a multi-pronged approach in that sense. On one side, I think we need to focus on changing the structure and the system that allow the problem to exist, while at the same time pushing and enabling citizens to be actually on the table when those that have the responsibility to design the laws and the rules are making those decisions. So it is really our capacity to be able to have to approach it as a multidimensional problem. It is what I was saying about the current challenge we face in terms of tax rules. We see them on the day-to-day actions of government in terms of the policies they're coming in when they're implementing value-added tax. It is in response to saying Kenya needs to be more competitive. We need to ensure that we are creating an enabling environment to attract foreign direct investment. Therefore, we need to shift away from taxes that are considered too high for business and shifting those taxes to consumption taxes, because again linked to the capacities of the state. Lastly, I think the other point I would like to add really that the idea of domestic resource mobilization goes beyond just resources. It goes beyond the question of providing resources to government. It talks about the contract, the social contract between citizens and the people that manage them. We have seen cases here in different countries in the continent where when you have that shift of governments really relying more on resources that are generated through taxation, their ability to listen, the leverage of citizens increases. That you see headlines changing in Kenya from this amount of World Bank money has been stolen to saying this amount of taxpayers' money has been stolen. Still the money is being stolen, yes, but the conversation is a different conversation. It talks about taxpayers' money, and that's part of the thing, I think, going forward in terms of when you talk of empowering citizens to have that voice in the decision making is also part of the narratives that we need to change, both from the bottom, but also from the top, from a structural perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Alvin. So now a final response, please, from Oscar. You can briefly respond to the other speakers' input, but also one question from the floor. The quantitative easing by central banks goes mainly to the financial sector. What do you think is the best way to change this route towards the public sector, the vital basic conditions like health and fair education, social care, affordable housing, environmental services, and so on? Please, over to you.
So I think that, well, in fact, I mean, it's still a case that most of the quantitative easing goes into government bonds effectively. And so actually you need to, I mean, it comes back to this issue of changing our governments and changing power, because if you have a progressive government and you get rid of some of the abysmal regimes we have at the moment in various parts of the world, then actually it's possible to direct public expenditure, because that's where, I mean, that's quantitative easing is going into government bonds, and then to direct that to tackling inequality, health systems, and so on. That can, I mean, there are obviously more technical fixes of that. For example, in the case of the European case, for example, the European Central Bank has been operating without criteria for how it does its quantitative easing. And simply, I mean, and there would be some benefit to greening what it does. And I mean, the EU has some level of the framework in that. So they have this thing called a taxonomy, which starts to define what are cleaner and dirtier types of assets. And that can go some way to being a framework for them saying, actually, we're not going to invest in certain kinds of assets because they are not in line with our climate change objectives. And they could do that. And there's also, to some extent, a conversation that is already happening even at the level of the governing council of the ECB. So it's not impossible to imagine that would be the case at some point. I think more broadly, it's the ECB is not really set up to be an investor on the kind of scale it is. And I mean, there is the Green New Deal for Europe sort of group of organizations, for example, said, well, actually, more of that investment should be done through the channel of the EIB, which, while far from perfect, is the better of the institutions at the moment, especially now it has this new energy policy. So also just shifting where the kind of how decisions about that financing are being made is going to help. And I mean, I think one broader point that I'd say is, which is about the kind of framings that we use. I do find that that a Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal now is still a useful framing, because what we used to have was that, so a lot of at the global level, a lot of governments will talk about green growth and green economy, and then the kind of mechanisms that were being put forward was a lot of things like, okay, we're going to introduce carbon trading to set a price on carbon to incentivize and nudge private sector to move in a certain direction. And there are various problems with that, but I think that one of them, so on the carbon trading, was that even in its own terms, it fails, because it's this very incremental approach that they're trying to pursue. And actually, we're not in a position globally in terms of climate change to follow an incremental approach. That, if you're just trying to push investments from coal to gas and gradually somewhere else, it's not, the timelines are just totally different. But then but then also actually it doesn't work in practice, because there is, in a nice economic model, you would have a trade that allocates funds in the most economically efficient way to tackle climate change. But the world is not full of actors who want to tackle climate change. There are vested interests in fossil fuels. And so the European emissions trading system is a case study of that, where in fact the rules are designed to actually to buy a lot of the lobbyists for big industry. And so in that regard, it wasn't even achieving the kind of pricing it wanted to. But I think the Green New Deal is a better framing, because actually it points us in the direction of public investment on a global level, and that's what we really need to be focused on, and recuperating those resources through the tax system that allows public investment to happen.
Great, thank you, Oscar. I have to say that unfortunately there won't be another round to close up, but your inputs were really insightful and very important. So thanks very much to our guests, Jayati, Alvin, Oscar, and Anne. It was great that you participated in this discussion. Also, thank you to the whole TNI team for their great organizational support, particularly Jess, Nick, Sarah, Jorrit, and the comms team. And I also would like to thank our interpreters, Monica and David, as well as you all for all your great questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry we couldn't treat them all, but we'll definitely make sure you can continue for a few minutes in the chat to discuss them. Tomorrow, there will be a Crash Course Economics webinar on debt crisis in the Global South, but also on development and dependency related to this issue, which TNI is supporting. Later this month, TNI is launching a new publication called Paying for the Pandemic and a Just Transition. It will bring some of the ideas presented today in a long read, so do look out for that. And as part of our Just Transition work, on Tuesday, 20 October, TNI and Friends of the Earth Europe organized a webinar towards energy democracies, transforming towards energy democracies, with stories from Indonesia, Australia, and South Africa. Then for our November Ideas into Movement webinar, a follow-up to this one, we are planning 2 webinars actually, co-hosted with the Institute for Policy Studies and the global implications on the global of the US elections. So the first will be held on November 10 and the second on November 23. And we're also starting a new monthly webinar series in Spanish together with Claxo, sorry. The first on 21st October will be on the new radical movements in Latin America. And our second on 8 November will be about the implications of the US elections for Latin America. Now, we have also put a poll on your screen, and we would love your input as we make our plans for our future webinar events. And if you enjoy the sessions we have been bringing together, and you might also want to check out our financialization primer, our State of Power 2019 report, which focuses on finance, some contributions from the speakers today, and also our book, Public Finance for the Future We Want. There you can see them. You're also welcome to email webinars@tni.org with any ideas and suggestions. To make sure you don't miss future events, we suggest you register for the TNI newsletter. So you can find a link in the chat on this. Well, if you found today's session useful, or any of the webinars we have held, please also consider making a donation via the TNI website to help us cover some of the costs associated with organizing this series. And thank you once again for joining us. We will leave the chat open, as I said, for a few more minutes so you can wrap up conversations there. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a nice day, evening, night. Bye.